Welcome. This is Ke Seto Kaiba back with part 3 of our Learning How to Learn mini-series. The first video dealt with this exact same game that we're about to look at here, except it had more of a beginner approach in its mindset. Part 2 dealt with more of an intermediate player. And now we are on to part 3, which is aimed at a little bit more advanced thinking. But it's the same game, it's a similar analysis. So if you haven't checked out part 1 and 2 already, feel free to go back and check that. A lot of the ideas that we discuss here will probably already be in the subconscious of an advanced player, and especially so for the material that's covered in part 1 and 2. So if you've already checked those videos out, then you can come back here, and afterwards, I guess, dive into this. So let's not waste too much time with it. Let's just get started. A lot of things to discuss here. So the game began with d4, d5. We had c4, queen's gambit. So far, it's all book moves, so usually the advanced player will just kind of breeze through this for the most part, as by this point they should probably have more or less an opening repertoire already built up. So we have c6. This time I used to play the Slav defense. Knight c3, knight f6. Again, all book moves. And then here we have bishop g5, which is a bit questionable, as we can see with the engine here. It already considers this move dubious. And sometimes, especially at a lower depth, the advanced player doesn't always just blindly follow Senipawn evaluation. Here it's not a huge difference. So you have to really analyze, why is bishop g5 not so good? Why is c captures d5 better here? And sometimes there's objective reasons. You can use the engine just like you can with any other move and try and reason out why this move isn't as good. We did analyze a little bit in part 2, but I want to expand on that analysis a little bit, because with the advanced player, you want to not necessarily get only the computer analysis, but you kind of want to see, what are the human players playing? What are top, human chess players playing this exact position? Usually that'll mean grandmasters, but not always. And so the best way to do that is to simply use some kind of chess opening database. Now, chess.com is a really nice opening database, and many other sites do. Unfortunately, chess.com, it's not free for everyone. So I just wanted to show an example of one place where it is free, so that way everyone can at least follow along. Every database will be the same for the most part, so you just have to learn the nuances of those. So all I did here is I just put in the exact same moves, and I went to this site here, and I'll post the hyperlink for this in the YouTube comments, or the YouTube description. That way everyone has the same resource. So yeah, this is a free opening database. You can use this whenever. I will make the standard disclaimers everyone should be familiar with. Whenever you put this, and we're simply talking analysis only. You cannot use this during the game. You can use this during daily/correspondence chess, but that is because that format has different rules than live chess or over-the-board chess. So in a regular game, you usually cannot use this. But in analysis like what we're doing here, using a database like this is perfectly fine. So okay, so now we get to the exact position here that we were at. And here it was bishop to g4. And so now we can take a look at the database and we can see what are some of the top moves here. And we can see how often, for the most part, black or white wins. Now this will not be exact because I did not include transposition here. And sometimes these lines will transpose back. And so you don't want to, just like with the computer analysis, you don't want to follow Senipawns too blindly. And here we don't want to follow the exact percentage all the time, because sometimes a move will create complications and a lot of people will go wrong. And it'll give a false sense of how successful this opening actually is objectively versus how successful it is against certain level players. Now, if you want to filter for certain players, you can filter here for example, anyone that's over under 2400, in this range 2200 to 2400. Different databases will have different places where you can filter. I'm just going to leave it at any for now and get kind of all ratings. And so here we'll notice that, what are the top moves? And specifically, because we're playing black, we want to see what gives black the best possible chance for winning here. And we see that even though the most popular move is e6, it looks fairly equal for both sides here. Very low draw margin, but it seems roughly equal as far as white and black winning. But here, d captures c4 is a really strong percentage here. 66% of the time black will win in a practical game. That is massive. I think anything that's probably like 50, 55, anything in that range is pretty significant. If you start getting over 55% in one way or another, it's usually pretty decisive. And so d captures c4 is definitely the best move, it looks like here, even though it's only the second most popular move. So let's go back to the game, and let's see. Well, so d captures c4, and we see the engine actually confirms that this is objectively the best move. And that is what I played, because even though I might not have been familiar with the opening database at the time, this was still opening theory that I was familiar with. But let's take a look at some of the other options, because this is something that the beginning player and the intermediate player doesn't usually do, or at least doesn't do with the same frequency. So let's take a look at e6. And the reason e6 is because that was the most popular move, so this is going to come up a lot. So, according to the engine, we can see that at this depth, it looks like e6 is the third most popular move. Looks like d captures c4 is best. That's what we're probably going to play in the future. Knight e4 is also not there. Knight e4 is also similar. That is second best. And then third best, we have e6. So we're going to look at e6 because that was the most popular. And we're going to see how is this position different than what we get from the main move. The main move meaning the move that we want to choose. And so here it looks like c captures is the best. And here is probably going to be e captures, but I'll let it load. And so we can see that e captures d5 is the next best move here in this exact line. And we can see a very staunch difference here, very stark difference with this position versus d captures c4. So in this position, a lot of players might wonder, why are we not capturing, towards the center? Generally, that's the opening principle. Why isn't c captures d4 the best idea here? I have trouble drawing arrows here. And so the answer is because this bishop is not necessarily a very good active piece right now. And even though the general idea is to capture towards the center, this is one of those exceptions where e captures d5 actually makes a lot of sense. So this bishop has a lot of potential in getting out. Maybe it'll go to f5, maybe g4. Most likely it'll go to f5, I think, in these structures, but you never know. But the point being, it has options of getting outside the pawn chain, whereas c captures d5 will not. So this position looks fairly normal. Looks like the engine says both sides about equal. But just doing this and kind of running with this line really as far as you want, and then kind of expanding over time, you get more or less a sense of what that opening leads to, and kind of the overall feel. This is something that a computer can't really do. It can give you objective moves, but it doesn't give you the human approach, the real, does this opening fit a play style or not? And by doing this and kind of expanding from the openings that you normally play, you start to learn very similar openings or little nuances within your opening. And this is a really good starting point to decide if you ever want to change your opening repertoire in the future, or maybe there's one line in your opening repertoire that you want to adapt. Then using this, you'll have this kind of in the back of your mind, and you'll say, oh, I remember this line was very similar. I like the overall feel of how that looked. Maybe I'll switch to that line. These are only a few semi-pawns difference. It's not going to make the huge difference. I'd like to stick to the best moves objectively and learn them really well, but this is not for everyone. Maybe against certain opponents you might want to change. So here, if we go back to the database again, we will see that knight e4 was another very similar move here. If you remember, the engine also looked at that. So let's take a look at that move now. So here, knight e4, and let's take a look. What is the general structure? What's generally going to happen? It looks like knight captures e4 is by far most common. A common here. Engine says it looks okay. So knight captures e4 is the engine line. Pawn recaptures, I'm sure. Got to get back your piece. And then we'll let this load here. And so it looks like it's between queen d2 or a3. And so with a3 and queen d2, both of them looks like it's going to be stopping a bishop from coming to b4 after we move this e-pawn out of the way. And so now we're realizing, okay, so bishop to b4 might actually be a threat in the future, and a3 just prepares to stop that. Maybe they'll advance, this b4 pawn. We're not really entirely sure. Queen d2 does the same thing. It just prevents a bishop from coming here. And so now that we kind of have an overall sense of what this looks like, we can go back to what we actually wanted to play. And we can see how is this different from those lines. And I think the difference here is very obvious in the case that black has taken a pawn. We are literally up a pawn versus the other lines. It was equal. But on the flip side, we need to take a look at the development here. Because here, we have one piece developed. This bishop is easy to develop somewhere along this diagonal. So very quickly we could get another piece developed. This bishop looks pretty easy to develop here, or b4. Queen is pretty easy to get out. Looks like play is pretty smooth in this line. With knight e4, we're trading off a pair of knights, which may or may not be so great. But at the very least, it's something that, something that we have to look at, because not always do we want to be trading material. And so, it's okay, but, generally speaking, you want to be keeping the tension, not trading pieces unless you have to. And as part of the opening, this does trade down. So maybe if, for hypothetically, you were playing a stronger player, you might want to trade when it's beneficial to you. And maybe if you're playing for a draw, go something like that. I wouldn't really recommend doing that too often, because generally speaking, a stronger player is going to know better than you are when they should be trading and when they shouldn't be. But it's just something to keep in mind, these little nuances. But okay, well, let's go back to d capture c4. So the book move, which they played, was e4, b5. And this is all opening theory still. Chess.com doesn't recognize it with the little book icon, but it is still opening theory. And so now we have a4. And this is obviously a mistake here. The engine confirms it's a mistake. And the reason it's a mistake, an advanced player will see pretty quickly, is because it allows the thematic pawn to b4 here. And we're just removing the defender because this knight is going to have to move somewhere. And then we have knight captures c4, simply winning another pawn. So a4 was not too good here. So with instead of a4, they should have done something like maybe a3 to prevent b4. Maybe they could have just continued development, say something like knight f3. There's a lot of options that they could use here, but specifically a4, it just allows b4 and winning material. So, white really didn't do too well at the opening. Maybe they would study it in the future and see, very simple mistake, they can correct it and move on. But for our perspective here, as more of an advanced player, we have to go to this and see. So after d captures c4 here, and then we have e4, b5. So this is the exact position here. And we'll notice that when they play a4, of course, b4 is the only move. But let's go back and let's see what could they have played. And so very similar to what we just did recently, where we were kind of getting a feel for what openings we really like, we should take a look at the moves here. So e5 is the most popular move. It scores very well for black. 64% is pretty big. But it's only got 67 games that it's looking at, so that's not huge. But, e5 is very common. Now, what's really interesting here is when we look at this with the engine, we will notice that e5 is not even in the top 3 moves. So we wouldn't even consider it. But from a human perspective, it looks like, why not push? We're gaining space in the center. We're going to attack this knight. And so it looks good. And so with that being said, I think an advanced player would probably recognize that e5 is not so great because we just have knight d5. And it looks like what is white really gaining? Maybe they're just overextending in the center. Now d5 is a little weaker. After e5, even f5 is weaker. Maybe like bishop f5 in the future makes sense, a lot of sense here. So these are a lot of ideas, but the fact that we've looked at the database and we've seen e5 is popular, it gives us an idea that if we didn't know what to do here, we should really look at e5 and study this, because even though it's not objectively best by the engine, we have to know a little bit of what to actually do if someone plays this. And so just like I was saying here, knight d5 was the best move here. Black is ready about -1, and that is because they are up a pawn and they've secured this pawn. So it's very difficult for white to get anything going. It's pretty much just a free pawn. As long as black can get developed and get a very fine position, they can consolidate their development. The material, they're just going to be up material. So okay, so let's take a look at a little further here. So we have a4 now, and we must think, well, okay, so if a4 is the best move, why can't we do the same exact idea? Why can't we just play b4? It's not one of the top 3 moves here, and so we have to examine, well, why is that the case? Why does b4 not work? And so we'll notice when we play b4 here, yes, we're actually kicking this knight, but there's no pawn on the e4 square. There's nothing that we're really worried about. It's not like we're removing a defender or something. And so with that being said, the knight can just simply move. And if the knight just moves, now this pawn is actually under attack, and our pawn that was supporting it on b5 is actually a little overextended. And so we can see we're probably giving this pawn back when we really didn't want to. So that's why b4 is actually not so great here. So there's many moves. I think h6 is fine. I think developing your bishop is probably okay at some point. So there's a lot of ideas here. You have to be a little careful about developing because although this is a normally good thing to do, we have to be very careful with, something like this, and we don't want to give back the material right away. So as long as we play actively and we do something to keep giving threats, like say h6, because then the bishop has to react, has to do something. Can't just lose their bishop. And once those threats, dissipate, and they're not going to win material here, then we can start developing, try and get, develop, get castled, and if we can do that successfully, we're just simply up a pawn. So okay, so back to the actual game, they played a4, and as we can see here, Black has played the mistake of playing bishop to b7. They wanted to get developed, and this is a normal thematic place to put the bishop in this type of opening. But here it missed the opportunity of a4, because a4 was an opportunity for Black to play b4 and get an advantage. But of course, White made a mistake, Black made a mistake, and they didn't really see that. And so it more or less, didn't really matter too much. Both sides more or less got away with this. But for a player who did see this, b4 is just simply winning on the spot. So bishop to b7 was played, and so if we look at the database, we will see that after a4, bishop to b7 is not even in the database. Eventually it's going to end. It's only an opening database. And so we see that with b4, Black is winning 90% of the time, which is really huge. And so with that being said, we could take a look at, well, how does b4 continue if we were to play b4? Because in the future we want to improve on our moves. We don't want to play these exact same stuff. Of course, if I get in this exact position again and I remember it, of course I'm going to play pawn to b4. So let's go back to the opening database and let's take a look at some of these options here. So what exactly happens after, pawn to b4? And so it looks like bishop captures f6 is a popular move. And it also looks like knight a2 is also good. Knight a2 has the idea of attacking b4. I'll show this on this board here. So if we were to go knight to a2, we're attacking this pawn. And how do we support that pawn? Of course, we could try pushing this, try and support that, but then white is going to win back the c4 pawn. And so we really, we don't want to be giving back material too easily here. And so because this knight has moved, this is removing the defender, just what we were looking at before. Because in this case, there is a pawn in e4. It's probably best to just take another pawn, in this case the e4 pawn. We'll be giving a pawn back, either this one or this one. And then whichever they give back, we're going to defend the other. So let's say they go like bishop captures c4. In this case, we really want to defend the b4 pawn. And, well, in this case, I guess we can just win a piece outright. But once they defend this, then bishop captures c4. And then we usually want to defend the b pawn here with something like e6 or e5. Probably e6. And then if it was to go the other way, assuming this bishop is not hanging, if we went here, let me see, what would it be? Instead of bishop captures, say we want to defend some other way, knight captures here, and then bishop captures b4, assuming this wasn't hanging in this case, say we made some move to consolidate first, then we have ideas of kicking this knight. This knight has to go somewhere, doesn't have too many squares, and then maybe we can find a way to protect this pawn. Maybe something like this, knight d6, maybe something like queen d5. Some of these more loose ideas and kind of seeing where your pieces are best located, this is something that you get by kind of messing around with the analysis and seeing what happens. So obviously in this exact position, knowing that this bishop is actually a big problem here, knight captures e4, of course they have to do something about it. So it's probably going to retreat, I'm guessing back to h4, maintain this pin on the e7 pawn, but it might not necessarily do that. So it looks like bishop e3 is the top engine move, which makes sense, they just hold the center. And so I want to see what the best move here is, and then I want to see the move that I was looking at. So the best move for Black is pawn to b3. And you can go with this as far as you like. This is complete preference and how far the player wants to learn opening, their opening. And you'll probably just expand on it slowly over time, move by move. And it looks like queen f3, is best, but again, Black is over -2 here. So this is really good for Black. Even if you just knew this, you'll probably have a huge opening advantage. But here we had bishop e3, and my intuition was bishop to h4. And so play the move that you're intuitive about, because if, that was your intuition, chances are someone around your rating is probably going to have a very similar perspective on this. So we have to know how to capitalize this. So why is bishop h4 not so great? And here it looks like the top engine move is queen a5. And now we're already getting ideas of this discovery. If we go here, there's this. The bishop is no longer on this diagonal, so now the bishop cannot interpose. And so that becomes more or less a problem. And so now it makes a lot more sense to me, just kind of using logic and reasoning to figure, okay, so this is why bishop e3 was the best move. And also bishop f4 is another top engine move here. And that is on the same diagonal. And even bishop c1, and it's kind of funny for a human perspective. We're like, why would they bring the bishop all the way back? But now that we've got the human approach on it, we can see really any bishop move along this diagonal, we have the option of going bishop d2 in the future. And so this makes a lot of sense to me. The fact that black would play knight captures e4 and white would not understand this about the diagonal, white would play a move like bishop h4. Now queen a5 is very strong because we're threatening to play b3. And, we may or may not do it right away because, of course, they have this knight interposing here. But when b3 is played, it's going to be very strong because this king has to move. And if the king moves, they've lost castling rights. That's probably going to be a lot of trouble for them. They don't want to interpose to the queen. Our knight is still here. And so white will actually have a lot of trouble defending this. And we can see this is even better than -3, even though black is only up 2 pawns right now. So this is a pretty big advantage. And this is also where the database in this case ended. So you can keep running with this as long as you want. But back at what actually was played, we did not play b4. We played bishop to b7. And I could show you could put this in, position not found in database. It's only an opening database. It's got to run out of moves somewhere. And so this is where you kind of transition back to the regular analysis. So here in the actual game, we played bishop to b7. Not really the best move, but it was what was played. And so white played pawn to f3, trying to secure the center, maybe try and cut down on the bishop scope. And so here black played pawn to a6, which is a thematic move here because oftentimes we get, this recapture this way. And that's exactly what happened in the game. We had a captures, which is inaccurate right now. This square would really like to be nice for the knight. Use the knight on f3. And so f4 is just their attempt to get a knight on f3. Maybe that'd be a little bigger priority, get white developed and have white get castled. But playing a captures b5 eventually is okay. And so black will play c captures to undouble their pawns. And now they have a really nice pawn majority here. So this is something else that an advanced player is going to be thinking slightly more often than the beginning player, intermediate player, is they're going to be looking at a little more pawn structure things. You're going to be considering things like pawn majorities. Because here, a very big asset in the position is the fact that black has 3 pawns here on the queen side, and white only has 1. So we actually have a 2-pawn majority over here, and we're up a pawn overall. So these are some really good strengths in black's position that might indicate, once black gets developed, if they can start playing on the queen side, this might be a very successful idea long term. Now, conversely, white isn't doing really too terrible either. Yes, they are down at the moment. White is down a pawn. But if white can get fully developed, and especially if they can restrict black from developing, maybe they can stop these pawns in the future. Maybe it's something like pawn to b3 is a thematic idea. Get this traded off. And before they recapture with the queen here on b3, they actually have this in-between move sometimes, bishop to b7. Bishop to b5 check. And then they can play queen captures b3. It doesn't quite work here because a6 has overprotected the square, but that would be necessary. Now, notice that if my bishop was not on b7, again, these are some of the loose ideas a more advanced player has kind of in their subconscious from playing an opening, is if my bishop was, say, on c8, and we had developed it somewhere along this diagonal instead, we would notice that bishop b5 might actually be possible in some lines, because the pawn would be pinned, and they could just take the rook for free. So the fact that the bishop is on b7, it'll really help sometimes not only control the long diagonal, but also if there's some capture here, the rook can capture on a8, it's not winning material, bishop recaptures a8, and they're in completely fine shape. Now, this is an opening idea that I did know at the time. I was familiar with this, and that's why I played bishop b7 in the game. Now, if we recall, when I played bishop b7, it was a mistake because I was thinking of a thematic idea of an opening, and I was so focused on playing the thematic ideas that I had memorized and learned that, of course, I wasn't paying attention to the fact that they played something different like a4, and my thought should have been, how can I exploit this? How can I take advantage of this, this unusual pawn move? And if I had done that and thought for a little bit, I probably would have came up with the move pawn to b4 and realized I can put my bishop on b7 at a later time. So understanding some of the nuances of the opening and then kind of having those loose ideas, you're more inclined to play the right things, once you start getting a little practice, a little experience with an opening. And if you don't play the right thing, it's literally just trial and error, where you mess up in the game. That's okay. You analyze it, you learn from your mistakes, and then you try again. And the more you play, the more you're going to inevitably lose. But if you keep analyzing your games and learning ideas, hopefully it could be a teaching moment, and long term it should help you improve in chess. So okay, so back to the actual game here. I was mentioning the pawn majority for black on the queen side, and I was also mentioning that we should be looking at pawn structure a little more closely. And so the key features that I'm noticing here is, what open files do we actually have? Because both sides do not have 8 pawns, and so we have to, look at this. Well, in this case, white actually has more or less the open or semi-open d file. There are no black pawns here, and so that is my observation. And maybe d4 could be advanced, d5, and maybe they could keep gaining space along this file, simply because the pawn structure demands that. We also notice that pawn to d5 immediately would even cut down the scope of this bishop, so that looks like an intuitive move from a human perspective. Now, conversely, black actually wants to be playing on the c file, because here, just like white with the d file, black seems to have, a situation where white has no c pawn, and black's pawn is really well advanced. So maybe something like rook to c8 or queen to c7 might be possible moves in the future. So these are some loose ideas of the opening for the player that has this opening more or less studied. And, in the game I was familiar with this, but as we will see, perhaps a little too familiar with some of these ideas and not so much calculation. Just like bishop to b7, you don't want to be so familiar with the opening idea that you play it blindly. You're not looking at chances to maybe play for even more. So here they play d5, which again, we just mentioned, it's a very human-looking move, and that explains why they play d5. It cuts down this bishop. But just as we were talking about, not as bad as me playing bishop b7 earlier, missing the chance to play b4. But in this case, pawn to d5 is not actually best. It's a very natural move, it's a very human move, but it looks like bishop to e2 and just continuing development, getting castled, they can push d5 later, might even be slightly better. So now we played queen to c7. Again, thinking of the c file. These are still good opening principles, from a pawn structure perspective, but there's no rush. We don't really have to play queen c7 right away. And so I think better chess, as the computer is recommending here, is to play bishop to d7. And the reason being for this is the queen is the piece of most value. And so generally speaking, we want to be developing the pieces of lesser value first. Quite frankly, the queen is such a powerful piece, we don't know where it'll be best located. But we might know where something of lesser value is best. And in this case, the b8 knight, where is this knight going to go? It can't go to a6, it's a friendly pawn that's not moving anytime soon. It's not going to c6 because, of course, the d pawn would take it. And so the only real square they have is knight b to d7. And so I think, a human perspective, this is a move that should be very intuitive to play and really calling out to be played. Why not just keep developing bishop to d7? I think that's one of the best moves here. Now, there are also, as we see with the engine, there's also an argument to be made that queen b6 is also really good. But this is more of an exploitating move because this diagonal is so weak, because of the fact that white has pushed f3, and so it just controls a ton of dark squares in white's camp and prevents white from castling kingside, because of course they cannot castle into check. But this is a unique case where it's taking advantage of white playing a move like f3. Usually they'll not play f3, this pawn will be back on f2. They'll have something like knight f3, good development, and they'll just play a normal game. In that case, queen b6 is not going to be so great, and we'll be committing the queen a little too early. So to play a move like queen b6, that would be a rare case where maybe moving the queen is justified because white has misplayed. But if one side doesn't misplay, or we don't necessarily notice that, I think it's a lot more natural to be developing your pieces to lesser value. So okay, so let's continue on. Queen c7 is not too bad, it's just not best, because we're still playing on the c file, so it still looks logical. So now we have queen d2. And remember, this was a common idea I mentioned earlier, where we sometimes play pawn to b3, and black will play d captures b3 at some point, and maybe sometimes bishop captures b5 to actually move. In this case, it's not, because this pawn can capture, and when they trade rooks, it's only a trade because this bishop happens to be in a optimal spot to recapture. But if this bishop was, say, somewhere else, if this bishop was developed to, say, d7, or the opening went slightly differently, then after this little maneuver here, instead of recapturing with the queen, white might be able to actually capture this way. They can't take back because this would be pinned, and then they can capture queen captures b3, and it's just a way to pick up one extra pawn and get a pretty winning, good winning position there. So these are some loose ideas to know. Maybe white did not know some of these concepts. Even though they can't take on b5 first, b3 is still good, because here it was, a 3 versus 1 pawn majority. This is not really a great pawn. It was an isolated pawn. And so if black was to, say, take it blindly, if they were just trying to get greedy with the material, then taking here might not necessarily be good, because, this move is just dropping material, and this isn't really enough to justify it. But as we see with the computer, if we take with the knight first, it's actually playable. And the reason why is we can't recapture this way, because we can trade here, but then queen captures b3 is probably going to be played. Oh, then we get the same bishop move. Okay, so yeah, same exact idea that we were talking about here. Yeah, I was just talking about it, and we overlook it. It's very common to overlook here. And so here you pick up an extra pawn. And, in this case, they've sacrificed a lot. Black was up 1 pawn, and in this line where the white has sacrificed the knight, now they're down by another pawn. But take a look at, white's biggest advantage or disadvantage here, which, if we go back a few moves, it was this 3 versus 1 pawn majority. So even though white has sacrificed more material, where's black's pawn majority? Everything was traded off. And so black's #1 asset in the position has now been lost. And maybe white, would have been in long-term trouble by 3 versus 1. Maybe black could have easily promoted some kind of, end game where white wasn't too careful, and now black has an extra queen. So that option is no longer here. So even though this might not be the best way to handle this, in a very practical sense, I think black would be maybe slipping in the position. I think even though they're ahead, right now, objectively, they're still up ahead by almost -2. And of course, black is up by 2 pawns. Their development is actually kind of tough. This is a pin knight here. This bishop has a very nice pin. Black has lost their queenside pawn majority. And how can black get developed? They're probably going to have to do something like this, be in shadow and get castled, or something along those lines. But it's not necessarily so clear from a human perspective. If you don't play too accurately, I think it's not so clear how black can actually get a good advantage and maintain it here. I think white has a lot more play than it looks. But okay, so in the actual game here, after queen d2, which wasn't best, black has actually blundered here. They play queen to e5. And if you've seen part 1 and 2, you will remember that we've discussed this quite a good amount, where bishop f5 kicks the queen again. And black is simply wasting too many moves moving the queen. There was no need to put the queen on c7. There was no real need to put it on e5. We're going to have our queen kicked, and it's probably going to go to somewhere like h5. And this is simply a lot of queen moves that could have been avoided. If black had avoided these queen moves and instead played more natural moves of lesser value, piece development, things like knight b to d7, I think they would have gotten a little better position. And, they'd still be up by 1 pawn. They would complete their development. They'd get castled, and I think black would just be up by 1 point and have a pretty good position. But they did not do that, so they've moved the queen, bishop to f4, best move, and then queen to h5, but, unfortunately they're moving their queen too much, and they're not really getting developed here. I think black has to be very careful. This queen is really not the best piece here. It's worth 9 points. It should be doing a lot or have a lot of potential, but instead this queen is sitting passively on the edge of the board. And black only has 2 pieces developed other than the queen, whereas white, on the other hand, they have these 3 pieces developed, and maybe their next plan is very simple. They play knight g to e2. They might play a move like knight g6, knight g3, bishop b2, get castled, and their follow-up is very straightforward. It's very clear what white should be doing. Black, on the other hand, They're not quite too terrible. It's not like they're untangled too badly. But knight b to d7 is really the only natural move that I see. It's not so clear if we should be playing e6 because things open up on our king. Similar with e5, it might be a little bit better because we're attacking this bishop. But then there's en passant capture, and although that is probably fine for black, they have to be a little careful and calculate correctly. So with all that being said, there's a lot of practical danger that we can see that black had a lot of these. I don't know if red flags is the right term, but they had a lot of these warning things that should have been in the advanced player's mind that are kind of building up and makes it more likely that black will blunder in the future. Because if they keep having to navigate all these little subtleties, if white's play is easier, it's more likely black is going to be the one to slip in the future. Too often, I think beginners just look at just the blunder. They look at just the move where everything literally collapsed. But sometimes they were under a lot of psychological pressure, or maybe they were under a lot of consistency problems with the position, and they just so happened to miss one move. But if your opponent is constantly pressuring you, you're more likely to make a mistake. So I guess the lesson to take away there is try and put a lot of pressure on your opponent. Play initiative, play attacking ideas, play developing ideas. Do all of those things yourself first, and don't be investing moves like wasting queen moves here, because if you do that, you might get into some trouble just like what black has done here. So queen g6, another queen move. e5 is actually best, and the reason e5 was best is yes, it does allow this en passant capture, and I'm sure this is one reason I didn't play this in the game. But what's really nice is that if there was this en passant, which I did not see as black in the game, I'm pretty sure, F captures and black is simply fine. It looks strange to have an isolated pawn here, but black's ideas are now simple. We can get this bishop out, we can get castle at kingside, we'll probably have an okay position. Maybe this pawn will even advance to e5 at some point, it'll be defended by the queen. At least now the queen is sort of justified in being on h5. But that did not happen in the game. So after this, we had knight to g3, which is a good move. The engine claims it's a mistake because there was a tactic now, knight captures b5, that was actually winning. And we did look at this in an earlier part, but I'll put it up on the board just so everyone can see it again. So knight captures b5 is actually a very strong move because when we have this recapture, we'll take the rook. It's a simple trade because the bishop was on b7. But now the problem is they have bishop captures b8 because this rook that was on a8 used to defend the knight. And I think this really just highlights the fact that black really should have developed their knight to b7, from b8 to d7 earlier. And so, it's easy to think, back in this position, oh, white just simply got a tactic, black didn't see it, they fell for it, maybe we should learn it. And yes, that's all true. But I think from a practical perspective, as a more of an advanced player, you have to think, why did this tactic come up? Why was this actually a problem? Why was this something that they even had the opportunity to play? And I think if we look at it from that perspective, we would see that if this knight wasn't on b8, if this knight wasn't underdeveloped, if it was actually doing something, if it was, say, on d7, they wouldn't have this actual tactic available. So keeping all that in mind, I don't think the problem was overlooking the tactic. Yes, that's superficial. Yes, that's true. Black could have seen this and prevented it. But realistically, I think it's actually worse than that. I think practically, it shows that black should have been developing their queen side, and they should have been getting their minor pieces into the game. So knight g3, our opponent did not punish us with knight captures b5. They did not see that themselves. And so we play knight f to d7, which the computer says is good, it's okay. e6 was best, but I don't really like knight f to d7 here. I think here the idea was going to c5, relocating like this. But realistically, why not play the b knight? Knight b to d7, and then you can play that knight to c5. At least get the undeveloped piece into play. By playing what was actually played in the game, now this knight on b8 is not too happy. He literally has no squares to develop to. So again, black is neglecting development, and long term, I think this could be a problem if it goes, uncorrected, I guess you could say. If it gets too far out of line. It is also worth noting here that, after this move, knight f to d7, although it's minimal, white is actually ever so slightly better. And, 20 centipawns is not much. That's only 1/5 of one pawn. Most humans do not think in terms that minuscule. But the point that now black is technically not winning. They've more or less lost the advantage, it really highlights the fact that this is more or less a turning point. Black is up material. They are up by 1 pawn. So where's their compensation? And in this position, it looks like, white actually has full compensation for being down material. So black's pawn majority on the queen side is not going anywhere. They are not getting developed too easily. And so if black doesn't have their strengths to rely on, then what exactly are they getting in the position? So we have bishop e2 developing. That's fine. Now, remember we were talking about black should be maybe playing on the c file from a pawn structure perspective, and white could maybe be playing on the d file. Now, thinking in that, if we were remembering that from earlier, then rook to d1 actually makes a ton of sense here for white. Even though bishop to e2 and getting castled is going to get castled sooner, rook to d1 makes a ton of sense, and now we're protecting d5. Maybe in the future we'll end up pushing. This could be a very strong initiative, something that black must react to. But unfortunately, our opponent did not see that. They just played normal moves, which is okay. They just kept developing. But it gives black the opportunity to play knight c5. Again, e5 is also a winning move. But again, that wasn't played. And so the opponent, not really looking at our ideas, they just simply castled. For the last several moves, they had development in mind, trying to get castled, and they weren't really paying attention to what black could do. Black should have played this knight probably instead, but they didn't. And so you have to wonder, why would they play a move backwards? Why would they go to c5? And if they had, looked at this knight too early, they would have realized that the knight is actually going to b3. And here, after the castle, which is normally a good move, white actually drops material here. There's knight b3, forking the rook and the queen. White had to do something about this, but they overlooked it. So queen e3 comes, and that's now a blunder. And the advanced player will see this fairly quickly once they see the tactical idea that this queen and king on the open diagonal is something that should be probably avoided. This pawn on f2 really should have been on f2. It shouldn't have advanced to f3. But that happened much earlier in the game. I was not a fan of f3 then. And still not, but it's really bad with the queen on the same diagonal. Better is just queen d1. If they take the rook, maybe a recapture, and everything is okay. They're down material, but at least white is with an okay position. But here, pawn to e5 is just winning on the spot. This bishop has to do something, and quite frankly, it really doesn't have anywhere to go. Once it goes somewhere, it moves. Bishop to c5 is a really huge threat, because this knight defends. We don't even have to take the rook. It just helps support this, and bishop for the queen, black would be massively better. So really best is, what can white do here? They have to prevent, the bishop. They have to look at, stopping the c5 score with the bishop. They can play en passant, but it's not going to matter much. White is simply lost here because of the location of their queen. So better would have been queen to d1. But they didn't see that, and similarly, black just wanted to win material. They didn't see the power of e5. Very similar to white playing a4, black didn't see b4. And I don't want to sound like I'm repeating opening ideas too much, but the concept is still very strong that, when one side makes a mistake, it doesn't really mean anything if the other side cannot capitalize on it. And very often, as you'll analyze deeper as a more intermediate and advanced player, you will still see a lot of opportunities where one side will make a subtle error and the other side will not capitalize on it. You'll especially see that at the beginner levels, but not always are they analyzing it from that perspective. So especially as an intermediate and more advanced player, you really have to be looking for places where your opponent played suboptimally and then really capitalize on those situations. So we have rook captures a1. And now the pivotal moment where the game really collapsed was pawn to e6. And of course, objectively here, this is really not so good, because now this allows queen to b6. And white is simply infiltrating with their queen. Everything is really going to collapse. If this pawn was not on e6, then queen is actually defending the b6 square, and so white's not able to infiltrate. Now, this was the last chance where black should have developed. They should have tried to get this piece into the game. It could have gone knight d7. It also helps guard the dark squares and keeps their queen out. And then from there, they could try and get developed, try and bring these pieces out, maybe something like this, and they have a fine position. Actually, if the knight is on d7, this is actually the same threat again. So again, the location of white's queen might have been able to save black and actually give them a really winning advantage here. But unfortunately, both sides didn't really follow through with that, and white did end up infiltrating because black made the last error. And really, this is game over from this point onwards. We could take a look at it, but it's bishop back. It just takes some material. This is fine. This is simply winning a piece. Knight captures b5 was even stronger, much stronger. But there's so many tactics in the position. How can you argue about taking a free piece here? They play bishop captures b8. You can't recapture with the rook because the queen, of course. And so where do you go? Of course, you gotta try and get your bishop out, maybe get castled soon. But of course, the problem is, regardless what you do, it seems like there's a different tactic everywhere. And all this was allowed because white was able to infiltrate. So, maybe if black was developing more, again, knight to d7 would have been guarding these dark squares. They probably could have prevented some of this problems from coming up before they actually came up. And so they took the material, black castles, queen to b7. We had a little bit of, back and forth with the bishop here. And then white is simply playing well because they're up by 5, they want to be trading. So they threaten the bishop, and they're also forking the rook here. So black is, I guess, incentivized to trade when they really don't want to, because they're down by 5. Black usually doesn't want to trade. And so I actually just chose not to. I figure it doesn't matter if I'm down by 5 or 8. I might as well get one piece active. I really don't want to be trading when I'm down that much material. But regardless here, white is much better. They played queen to d6. I captured here. I recapture, and then bishop e6, of course protecting the bishop. But now, of course, the problem, knight e7, and this is really terrible because my king has to go somewhere. This rook is hanging, and I can't even recapture because then there's checkmate right away. And so I just resigned at this point. But it's still instructional to see why did black have this downfall. They were playing a good game. They played well out of the opening. And here they would have had a really good chance to actually take the game right away. Play b4, they would have had a really good advantage. But even here, based on the way white was playing, black had an advantage of roughly -2 here. Yeah, -2.5 or so. Really good opportunity. And maybe if they had just continued development, knight b to d7 is one of the engine moves here. h6 is the top move. Again, keeping the initiative, kicking this bishop. But eventually, black is going to get developed. They're simply up a pawn. They have a nice queenside majority, and they should have been able to be fine. But this is where they started playing a little suboptimally. They started playing slightly inaccurate by this queen move, committing the queen slightly early. And then eventually we moved the queen again, started getting into some trouble. And it seems very easy to spot after the fact. But during the game, this is something that is not that obvious. And this is something that becomes very obvious after analysis, but only if you put in the work to actually take a look at this and try and realize, where did one side go wrong? Where did one side really start to pull away? And here, this is really the start of where white is really getting a really good position here. And so there's a few tactics that were missed, but both sides were developing. White blindly missed this and really let black back in the game. Otherwise, white was simply ahead. But black takes some material, and then unfortunately they give it back as white will infiltrate. Again, black was not developing, and that was pretty much the game from there. So we'll bring it back to the end there. And so from that, that was my more glance as more of an advanced player looking back at this game that was played when I was roughly 1500. And the analysis process is really the same. Regardless what your rating is, you're just trying to find ways to improve. You're just trying to find your mistakes and correct them. It just so happens that sometimes you kind of layer these ideas, and as you grow as a chess player, you start to consider different things. In the beginning and intermediate video, I wasn't looking at things like pawn structure. I wasn't really considering pawn majority as much. But as an advanced player, it becomes more and more important to consider those things in the game. In the intermediate video, I actually did mention a little bit about clock management. And although it wasn't too terrible in this game, that is something that maybe a beginner isn't necessarily always considering in an analysis of a game, when maybe they could be. So little examples like that. But if you're just a complete beginner, or even someone who you wouldn't consider yourself intermediate yet, but you've got a little bit of chess experience, there's still a lot of use in just analyzing and finding mistakes and blunders and correcting it. Because over time, that's just going to help you improve. If you make a mistake, that's not really a big deal unless you keep making the same mistake over and over. So I hope this video was helpful to everyone, especially from a slightly more advanced perspective. Now, ironically, this might be slightly shorter than the other videos, but that's because a lot of what the advanced player looks at in their games, it's a lot more in their subconscious. A lot of these ideas are like opening thematic concepts, things they're already familiar with. You just kind of look it up once and you're kind of done. Same thing with the opening database here. Once I put this position in the database and I'm familiar with it, it's very rare. It's only occasionally that I'll go back to the database and maybe find some games that I could see. Well, out of this opening, maybe I could take a look at some of the games. Like if I was to go back a few moves here, I could be, well, what actual games are in this position? What games are from this position? And you just do that for each side and kind of get a feel for the position. Specifically with databases, sometimes people even pick a favorite player and see how they handled it. Maybe your favorite grandmaster got the exact same position. Maybe their playstyle fits yours, and it might benefit you to actually kind of copy their move and see what happens. So, hope this helped everyone, and I will see you all in the next one.